Okay. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Sounds like we all had a lot to discuss over the break. And for everyone that's just joining us, welcome to the Symposium Climate Justice and Cities at the School of Cities. My name is Laura. I'm your MC for the day. And I am so pleased to welcome our second panel, who will be discussing the access to environmental infrastructures. And Karen wanted me to remind everybody that there is a QR codes around the room that you can access the program for today, so you can see the full agenda, who's speaking, and lots of other important information. And if you're joining us online, you can ask a question at any time through the chat. If you're here in the room, there'll be people going around with pieces of paper that you can request and write down your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Robert Soden to our white microphone chair, and he will be moderating this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I'll introduce our panelists from up here. So my name is Robert Soden, and really excited to welcome you to panel number 2. Panel number 1 this morning was fantastic, so we have our work cut out for us. But we have an important topic and some really good panelists with interesting projects to talk about. So I think we can do it. Our panel topic is equity and access to environmental infrastructures. So we'll be talking a little bit about what do we mean when we say environmental infrastructures, what are some of the politics surrounding what counts as environmental or critical infrastructure. Following up on that first panel, of course, we'll be talking about data and how data shapes our understanding of these infrastructures. And then as well, some of your questions about these topics and how we can build better alliances, help communities come together around infrastructures. So I'm going to start introducing our panelists now. And first off, we have Nidhi Subramanyam from the Department of Geography and Planning. You can come up. And Nidhi's project was called Modeling Just Stormwater Infrastructures for a Flood-Resilient Toronto. Next up, we have Alex Filazzola from Biological Sciences, whose project was called Urban Parks for People, Anonymized Movement Data to Determine Access and Equity. Both of these projects are around the GTA. Our third panelist has an international perspective, Amy Bilton from Mechanical and Industrial Engineering, whose project was Community Adoption of Eco-Technology and Grassroots Approach to Climate Change Adaptation, a participatory study of rainwater harvesting initiatives in Mexico City. And then finally, we're joined by a really wonderful international discussant, Maya Carrasquillo, who's in the Department of Civil Environmental Engineering at UC Berkeley. Maya works on issues related to water management, infrastructure, and environmental and social justice. And so let's begin. I'm gonna transition over here. As with the last panel, we'll talk amongst ourselves for about 30 minutes or so. And then we'll save 15 minutes at the end for your questions. As you do have questions, please just raise your hand and pass them to some of the volunteers around, and they'll come up to me. Feel free to start putting them in as soon as they come into your head, and we'll try to. And then we'll save, again, the last 15 minutes for our international discussant. I want to begin really allowing each of our panelists to take a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, and just describe their projects so you really understand the work that they're doing and where they're coming from before we dive into some of our questions about these topics. So I'm going to ask kind of a framing question for each of our panelists, and that is, how does your research help us understand and plan to overcome urban challenges pertaining to unequal accesses to environmental infrastructures? And do we have a volunteer to kick it off?
I'll go first.
Wonderful, thank you.
So I'll go first. So the challenge that we've been looking at is equal access to water. So many areas in the global south have informal settlements, peri-urban areas around city centers, which don't have access to critical infrastructure, and particularly looking at piped water. So we've been working with partners in Mexico City to look and examine some of these challenges. And in Mexico City, people who live in these areas, typically how they access water will either be through pipas, which are water trucks, which will deliver water, or they have to go and buy bottled water. And this is really a disproportionate amount of the particular population. It takes them a lot of their time, and it's a large issue when you're thinking about equality and justice for these populations. So there's been a recent push in many of these areas to think about distributed infrastructures which can provide access to water. So in Mexico City, there's a social enterprise called Isla Urbana that's actually been working to install rainwater harvesting systems. They've actually been through different government schemes, install about 25,000 of these. And the idea is you can capture rainwater from rooftops. There's some basic kind of treatment, and then it's stored for use when the population wants it. So despite the fact there's been quite a few that have been put out into the field, there's still a lot of critical aspects in terms of the systems actually being used and used properly to think about maintaining appropriate water quality. So in our project, we've been truly trying to unpack if these systems are being used, how they're being used, and what can be some of the barriers towards actually thinking about appropriate use of these types of systems. So we've had a multidisciplinary team with myself, Dr. Ron Hoffman from Civil Engineering in UChenn, a social scientist, with our graduate students to really examine these aspects and look at it. We've gone through a series of engagement with our partners and our stakeholders, doing interviews, assessing survey, doing field assessments to look at understanding what's been going on with these infrastructures and what some of the gaps are. We found things like, sorry, let me just quickly. There's a lot of confusion about the water quality, and how the rainwater harvesting system should be used. And then when they're actually installed in the field, there's lots of cases which actually would contribute to poor rainwater quality. And looking more at these aspects, we've delved into future research and have been able to leverage our work through the School of Cities to be able to go into future research projects where we're actually looking at assessing some aspects of water quality, how people are interfacing with their systems, and taking some of that information to look at what should be done to be able to look at maintaining water quality and what guidelines need to be in place for these types of systems. And then also just understanding more about how these systems are designed and built to make them something which will be more likely to be adopted. And those are our future research directions looking at this type of technology.
Great, thank you. Alex, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, so our research, we were really interested in trying to understand how people use parks. So I think everyone here can kind of understand, or kind of at least guess, when parks are going to be more used than others. You can imagine weekends are probably more common than weekdays. It's of interest, like a waterfall, is going to be viewed more often. But when we talk to different park managers, like different conservation authorities, different cities, they actually don't really have any idea of quantifying specifically how many people are going in and out of these parks. It's a lot of anecdotal information. It's probably accurate, but trying to actually say that this many more people on a weekend, there's say 20% more people going to a park than a weekday, that's information that's still largely missing. And when it comes to trying to manage the different types of green spaces, all different aspects from health, equity, what have you, it's very challenging to make informed decisions unless you actually can quantify how these people are using different types of green spaces. So that's where we try to leverage some anonymized cell data coming from smart devices. And we partnered with a company called Mapbox, which uses data off of their software development kits. So if you've used any application that probably has a map, you can imagine something like Strava, Skip, different types of these mobile apps. They track your location services, assuming you actually allow the location services to be tracked. And so we're able to use that anonymized activity index to try and see how do people use parks. And it did follow the patterns that we'd expect, points of interest, weekends, but we were able to kind of get a little more granularity there. And we're able to see, well, when people go to parks, how often do they use trails? How often do they go overnight? How often might they go to Park A versus Park B? And important, particularly from an equity perspective, is to try and situate it within the demographics of these different types of parks. Do we notice that parks get used more often in some communities versus others? do people have access to green spaces? For instance, you might be within 500 meters or 100 meters even of a park, but if the activity index there is low, perhaps something is wrong. Perhaps there's fencing in around the park that limits access. Perhaps it's an unsafe park, some other reason why you might feel not wanting to visit this park. And so trying to quantify this information, we've begun untangling different reasons why we might start seeing different patterns in how these parks were visited. Some of the initial things that we observed were there was a large difference in terms of housing in the area. So strangely enough, single detached homes tended to be closer to parks and have higher activity, have parks that had activity, which is a little perhaps not exactly what we'd imagine, because people with single detached homes have their own private green space. They have backyards, they have these other areas where they can recreate, whereas someone who's in an apartment building who may have limited access to their own green space or no access at all, now they need to travel further to a green space, and then also that green space that they travel to, perhaps they're visiting less often for reasons that we're still trying to untangle. And that's been kind of the ongoing work that we're doing with. So we started this off as a postdoc. Now I'm working at a company called Apex, and we're still kind of trying to untangle these questions. We're still partnering with school cities and UTSC to try and further explore this, but we're also connecting with different types of community partners. So we're talking about park people, trying to understand why some parks might be visited more than others, trying to connect with the park managers, so Toronto Conservation Authority, the City of Toronto, Parks and Forest Service, trying to understand why the patterns that we're seeing, how we can perhaps facilitate activity at certain parks that are perhaps underutilized, and perhaps better manage parks that are a little overutilized in terms of what we're observing in terms of activity. And then the next step on top of that as well would be trying to see how those patterns might play out over time, and trying to see, well, when certain days, can we predict increases in patterns, and especially in other communities that are growing, such as we've been looking a lot at in the Halton region, where a lot of housing developments are being built actually overnight in and around different types of green spaces. How can we look at the changes in patterns that are predicted for these areas, and what might that mean for in terms of the resident use and also the nature or the biodiversity associated with that park?
Thank you very much. Nidhi.
Well, thanks, Robert. And I also want to thank several people that I've been in dialogue with over the last 2 years, from outside the university who are here today, from the city as other community-based organizations. So welcome. So our research, as Robert introduced, focused on modeling equitable ways of distributing stormwater infrastructure to achieve a flood-resilient Toronto under future climate scenarios. So one of the biggest challenges that most cities, including Toronto, face is that we have very limited resources to invest in stormwater infrastructures for adaptation, even as precipitate patterns and flooding threats continue to evolve due to global warming, rapid urbanization, and even land use change. So it's really important that we optimize our investments such that we are protected against most, if not all, stormwater events in the future. But this sort of raises other questions, and that's where we started getting to our research challenges. So what is the worst case rainfall scenario that our city can face given our current stormwater infrastructural capacity? Or if we put it another way, what is the worst case scenario associated with the maximum loss that we are able to tolerate? And how do we upgrade our stormwater infrastructures going forward to help us remain resilient in that scenario? So as a first step, our team started to review various policies and plans for flood resilience in Toronto to understand what were the future rainfall scenarios that the city was preparing to be resilient for. And surprisingly, we found that of this dozen odd plans and policies that we scanned, most acknowledge changing precipitation patterns, but none actually outline any specific future rainfall scenarios that the city must be safeguarded against. So to calculate worst case events or scenarios, our team members who are operations, research, and engineering, Dr. Sheng Liu at Rotman School, who's joining us online, and his postdoctoral colleague, Aichi Zhang, started to mathematically compute worst case scenarios that should guide future stormwater infrastructure planning. So after doing their modeling, what they argue is that for a given rainfall return period of frequency, say a 1 in 100-year storm, there are actually different worst-case scenarios depending on the rainfall event's intensity or duration. And those can produce very different flooding losses and damages depending on our city's infrastructural capacity. And their model shows that for cities with greater, stormwater retention capacity, but very poor flow and discharge capacity, short, intense rainfall periods can be far more damaging. Whereas for cities with higher discharge rates, a longer rainfall event may cause damage for the same return period. So one takeaway from their model is that a city would need a combination of storm sewer network and retention facilities as part of its broader stormwater infrastructure complex to confront those future scenarios of varying intensity and duration. Now that's not new, but I think sort of quantifying what the intensity and duration that we need to prepare for, and as a city having some of those dialogues with stakeholders as to what is the worst case we want to tolerate would be an important sort of dialogue going forward. So that brought us to the next challenge. So the stormwater infrastructural capacity is distributed between a gray storm sewer network that conveys rainwater to water treatment facilities and later on to Lake Ontario, as well as a lot of decentralized green and blue water retention structures of varying option and water retention capacity. So parks would be one example of that, just like Alex was talking about. And they would temporarily or permanently help to retain some of the stormwater infrastructure so as to not overwhelm the storm sewer system during those high intensity rainfall events. Now, as you can imagine, these infrastructures are unequally distributed across the city. There is no openly available data on the gray storm sewer network, so it's difficult to comment on its distribution. But our team used openly available data on green cover distribution to estimate how parks and open spaces are distributed across the city. And similarly, much like what Karen described in the first panel, we also constructed an index of social vulnerability using Statistics Canada variables, which helped us understand where some of the most vulnerable communities in Toronto were located. And they are capable to deal with climate extremes. So unsurprisingly, we found a very strong positive correlation between social vulnerability and a lack of access to green infrastructure across the city. So given that there is this inequality, part of the urban challenge is also distributing that future infrastructural capacity across multiple infrastructures and these various vulnerable flood-prone communities so they remain safe, protected, and resilient during those identified worst-case scenarios. And so I think there is an opportunity here, and speaking of what some of the first panel identified as issues of structural disadvantage and racism, perhaps there's an opportunity here as a city to correct that through our future infrastructure planning work. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Robert.
Okay, thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear about all of your projects. Just to kind of start off, one of the things about infrastructure is that it's sort of inherently a collective accomplishment or a collective issue of concern. Scholars in critical humanities and social sciences often argue that infrastructure is a deeply socio-technical and relational issue. And what counts as infrastructure, what we think of when we sort of decide to call something infrastructure, often depends on sort of how we're coming to it and our relationship to it. As a result, there's a politics, and there's often debates about what is considered environmental infrastructure or critical infrastructure in these contexts. And so I'm wondering from each of your field sites, each of your areas of research, how do these debates over what counts as critical structure and what's important about that infrastructure show up, and then how might that relate to some of our core concerns about equity and climate justice? And Nidhi, would you like to go first on this one?
Okay, sounds good. So as I was already mentioning, stormwater infrastructure is both what we think of as sewer pipes underground, and as we know, what is out of sight is out of our mind. And for the most part, I'm sure most of us don't know what sort of pipes run below our streets and buildings. And that makes it really hard for us to know whether we live in a place that actually has the kind of storm sewer network that's going to protect us in the future. So that's one thing. Thinking about specifically stormwater infrastructure, what came up repeatedly in our project, because flooding is so multidimensional, basements could be somebody's homes, but they're extremely vulnerable depending on which part of the city they are in. And if you think about who lives in basements, they are usually low-income tenants. And the City of Toronto really has a basement flooding protection program that has been ongoing for several years. And they have been trying to address this issue. But as you know, if we think about the growth that's taking place in the GTA, and the sort of immigrants who are coming in, people, students, a lot of these people inhabit basements. So we really understand how housing, which is providing shelter to people, could also be at risk in a future flooding event. And I did talk about the green infrastructure and blue infrastructure. This is, things in people's yards, in private buildings, institutional buildings. These are all produced and managed by very different actors and agencies. So it's also hard to coordinate, how these people are producing it and whether we might be producing enough of it to protect our city. But I think there are opportunities there because, somebody's yard is also space for recreation. It could be a place where you grow plants. There are all these co-benefits that green infrastructure produces. And we want to ensure that we are, as a city, promoting them in ways that really provide those benefits to people who may otherwise not have access to land or green spaces and green infrastructures. Those are all the different kinds of infrastructures entangled with Toronto's flooding challenge.
We struggled to try and define what we would define as a park within our area, because if we looked at what is a green space in Toronto, well, if you sum up all the different types, so playgrounds, golf courses, schoolyards, it ends up being something very high, like 30% of all of Toronto has some green space. And if you try and see the commute time, well, everyone then is within like 200, 300 meters of something that qualifies as a green space. But as most folks here probably realize, those are not all the same things. And some of the patterns that we started to see emerge, for instance, golf courses tended to be in communities that were more heavily immigrant communities. Some were situated in very poor communities relative to neighboring communities. And so the folks that are these locations are found in are not necessarily the ones that are most likely to be using these green spaces. And then there's other limitations that might be limiting access. And so we were trying to at least refine a little bit first, what is a park? A park in the sense of it's usable for all, accessible for all, no private entrance, not used for an alternative purpose, such as a cemetery and a golf course. These are certainly green spaces in their own right, and they have function in terms of ecosystem services and providing biodiversity, but they're not the same type of service that would be provided for residents. And when it comes to providing an area to get, say, away from heat in the summer or to recreate or socialize, these have limited functions compared to what might be considered a true park. And then you also have other park areas that are maybe more commuter areas, like ravines that are used for trail networks for people commuting to work. They try and avoid roads. And we trying to break apart that's when we started to see there's more inequality that's being observed in terms of parks access. And it's not that parks are everywhere throughout the city. Some parks are more park-like, I guess, than others. And those parks tend to be situated to areas that might be perhaps a little more affluent and not to necessarily the folks that perhaps need it most.
Yeah. So when I think about infrastructure, really what I think about more generally is some collective services or materials which contribute to the health and wealth of the people who are living within that community. So that's the very general definition that I think about when I'm thinking about what is something that is infrastructure. In our work that we've been doing under the School and Cities grant, we've been thinking more about water access and some informal settlements around large cities. But thinking more generally about those informal settlements around large cities, there's a lack of access to all sorts of critical infrastructure. And I think there's really, water is just one of those pieces. And in terms of the population that lives there, there's really a hierarchy of needs that are, when we're here in Toronto, are things that are met by centralized infrastructure, which are not accessible to many of those populations. So what we think about in our work is really those pieces which fill essential needs. So we're talking about, access to water, access to energy, access to sanitation. Those are probably the top three that are on the list. But then there's all the other pieces which come together under that as well. So it's really how I think about it is like really those essential kind of pieces.
Yeah, one of the things that to me came across really, really strongly in all three of those responses, this question of what are the benefits of infrastructure and how do we sort of come to grips with understanding them? How do we talk about them? And often when we do that, we want to go to questions of data and modeling. And we heard a lot in the first panel this morning about data and data's role or not in helping to accomplish climate justice. So I'm curious from your perspective, let's maybe follow up on some of those conversations from panel one about data. So what is the role of data in helping you all understand the infrastructures that are at stake in your work? Are there data gaps that you see as being really important? And does the current use of data in these settings, is that helping the situation, or is it in fact contributing to climate inequity?
If I can start on that one.
Please.
So I think data is really critical to be able to understand really the scope of the problem, and installed infrastructures, for the rainwater harvesting, for example, it's understanding really, how it's being used, what are some barriers or aspects of how it's being used which are making it not being used in the proper way or in the way that's going to benefit the population most. So these are all critical questions that there's not always information on. So in the work that we're doing, we're often dealing with informal settlements. So there is sometimes some census data, often not. The organizations that we work with go and collect some survey data when they're actually going and doing the installation, but it's inconsistent. It's really, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's missing really critical information. So I think there's a really strong need to collect that kind of data, because otherwise you don't know really where those gaps really exist. And in our work, that's really where a lot of our work is actually going, is to try to really try to fill some of those gaps. There's things that you can do thinking about surveys and interviews, but there's pieces when you're thinking about installed infrastructure that aren't captured in that as well. And people have biases, or they try to answer how they expect the surveyor to want them to answer. So we'll collect that data, but then we think that there's also a role to be able to actually think about leveraging some technology which is accessible now in terms of distributed sensing to really unpack how something is being used and be able to really think about some aspects about how we can improve these types of green infrastructures.
Yeah, similarly with our data, we found it solved a lot of problems. It helps answer, using this anonymized cell data, we're able to say, well, is there a problem? What is the problem? Where is it? But it really didn't answer the why there's a problem. And you can look at satellite imagery and you can kind of come up with different hypotheses why you might see a park is more visited than others, why there might be inequality in terms of visitation. But at the end, you still required a lot of kind of on-the-ground knowledge. And when you talk to folks, they would say, oh, I know why the park isn't visited. It's stuck in a deep ravine or something that looks like a fence line that you couldn't tell from, say, a photo or what have you. Someone would tell you about it, or the aspect of it feeling unsafe, whether or not it was unsafe. is beyond it, is the feeling of that or the perception of that, perhaps because of lack of lighting. These are reasons why trying to untangle the why requires more than, I think, just kind of a data, well, it is a form of data, but really kind of this like knowledge of trying to connect with different individuals, get their perspectives, particularly local residents, and try and tease apart. Once we've identified the problem, and again, the data was fantastic at identifying it, trying to figure out how to try and solve it and come up with solutions going forward.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think, if you think of flooding, because it's such a multidimensional problem, we need different kinds of data to understand both how flooding happens, but also how it's impacting different groups in this. So I think, one of the challenges that we faced is there's these things called intensity depth frequency curves, which are used to actually design stormwater infrastructure or understand, future rainfall scenarios. And what our team, when we were downloading that data, what Sheng and Aichi found is those are not adjusted for future climate scenarios. They are more retrospective. So they had to make assumptions about future climate scenarios to predict some of their models. And so that is like one kind of challenge, is how can we take that climate knowledge and apply it to this kind of rainfall pattern to make those future scenario predictions. Again, like I said, data on a lot of kinds of infrastructure are not readily available to be downloaded from the open data portal. And this could be an issue because it actually is from getting communities on the table to understand how they might, perceive infrastructure and how they locate it, or whether they can go somewhere and see, oh, am I infrastructure deficient? Am I safe or not? And then if you think about flooding, there's riverine flooding, which is what happens when rivers and creeks overflow their banks. But there's also urban flooding that happens because of, extreme events, or infrastructure leaks, or is deficient. And whereas the TRCA has done a very good job of mapping floodplains in Toronto, we don't really have great data on urban flooding, or what flood extents might be under different kinds of future rainfall frequencies. And that is knowledge that some private companies have, going back to what was raised in the first panel. And it's also a problem and creates inequities because people cannot know for themselves how safe their house is today or how it might be in the future. So I think there is room here to make available publicly accessible data on, future flooding events or risks, and kind of updating it over time. So I think what is data also has political stakes. I know it's doing some of this work and is spearheading an effort called the Toronto Climate Observatory, which is going to, gather some of this locally available data. So kind of excited about that.
Great. Yeah, and you can find Nidhi or I in the break if you'd like to talk about the Climate Observatory. We're going to move in just a couple of seconds to Q&A from the audience. But before we do that, I just had one more question. And that's, moving forward, thinking kind of next steps in each of your field sites, thinking about some of the challenges you've all mentioned in terms of what counts as infrastructure, what our data can and can't tell us about it. What are some opportunities for bringing more diverse perspectives, ways of knowing and forms of understanding to bear on these questions of inequitable access to infrastructure in your sites?
I can jump in. So one thing we've started doing is connecting with a few other cities, and it's been really interesting to learn that it seems obvious now, but all these different cities have quite a different patterns and different concerns that they're experiencing. And this is all within, for instance, Canada. We've been looking at Calgary, Montreal, and Vancouver, and each of these cities has approached us with a very different problem that they're trying to solve, and they're hoping that using this anonymized data might help address some of their interests, some of their concerns. And I think having the more people we connect with, the more we talk to, the more we try and find utility for, has really helped us move forward to try and solve some of these things, and kind of opened our eyes to like the more and more different issues that could be arose as a result of this type of data. Solved it, and then also trying to address some of these concerns going forward.
Yeah, so in our work, we are thinking about the next steps and how we can think more about we can promote inclusive design and implementation of distributed rainwater harvesting systems, and we are working towards truly multidisciplinary approach, working with researchers from the social sciences, and Nidhi is actually one of the people that we've been talking to about it. And engineering to kind of look at how we can take together complementary aspects of what each field can bring. So, you know, we're engineers, we're good at building systems and doing design, sometimes, not always. But what we can do is we can think about the gaps that exist in the particular technology. We can actually build sensors, which we can put in systems which are in the field and gather information about how the systems are being used. And then we can think about how we can merge that information most effectively together with those from the social sciences. And another place that we're actually also working as well is in our work we found there are issues with the water quality within these systems. And we're trying to really unpack that as well in terms of what can be done there, quantitatively looking at what sensing and monitoring should be done on the types of systems that are put out in the field. And there's no real framework as well or guidelines behind how to monitor the water quality or to assess the water quality in these types of systems, which is really critical. If you're thinking about water infrastructure here in Toronto, there's a really strict way that it is monitored and assessed, but that's not the case in these types of infrastructures. So we're thinking more about how we can contribute towards building up a framework which would enable that to be done more generally.
Thanks, Amy. I would echo that sort of cross-disciplinary dialogue, and School of Studies has really helped to build that community among some of us. In our case, it was very useful to work with someone who approaches this from an uncertainty perspective coming out of operations research, and how, as planners or as a social scientist, I think of uncertainty is very different. It's not something I would understand mathematically. And so I think that was a useful tension, and a lot of times led to good dialogue in our own research project. I think in terms of next steps, we have been with several policymakers and planners who've been working on the City of Toronto's resilience strategy. So I think we really are trying to approach different agencies in the city and understand how they understand flooding and how they think it affects their service or their agency's mandate. And I suspect, we've been finding very different answers, which again proves that there's no one answer about what is flooding, worst case event. And I think in the next step, we do want to go to communities at risk and really understand what they see as a worst case scenario, how much loss are they willing to tolerate, and what sort of infrastructural solutions might help them feel safe and secure.
So we have a couple.
Just before we get to the Q&A, somebody from the audience just asked to make sure to speak up. Let's keep your microphone up.
Thanks. So we have a couple questions from the audience, and the first is right. So inequitable access to environmental infrastructure is not a new thing, but climate change is certainly intervening in the situation, and in ways that may alter it, heighten it, potentially make it worse. So how do you see that? Thinking again, kind of moving forward with this work, how do you see climate change kind of intervening in these questions of access to the infrastructures you're all looking at?
I guess I can kick it off. I think for the types of populations that we're working with, we're again thinking about informal settlements. They are among the most at-risk populations when thinking about climate change. They are the ones that are impacted the most by extreme events and weather. There's not access typically to adequate storm. There's not access to adequate sanitation, so flooding events have larger public health impacts. So I think there's a lot of critical questions, and a lot of the issues are going to get even more extreme, and a lot of the inequities associated with many of these locations are going to become even larger. So I think that poses a lot of critical challenges and makes thinking about that and doing this type of work, thinking about these type of distributed infrastructures which can be put in place in many of these areas, more critical, going forward.
I can go next. So, if you think about climate justice, the idea is, in a nutshell, really righting what was wrong in the past. And if the fact that infrastructure has been unequally distributed in the past, then the solution that we are building for a sort of climate-safe scenario in the future has to actually start from the perspective of who is most vulnerable, who is most at risk, and design infrastructure with them in mind, and probably not design it with things like costs and efficiency and those kind of values centered around infrastructure. So I think this is an opportunity to do better, and I think we should seize that and really center people who don't have access or really were harmed by previous projects in our future designs. So that's all I'd say.
Yeah, both those answers are great. It's hard to follow up, but I will add that we have noticed that there's a big change in behavior under different, more extreme climate scenarios. And so for one example would be that under a very hot day, the way green spaces get used is very different than not a hot day based on different inequalities among folks. So you might see people that have more willing to stay inside because they have air conditioning, or they'll drive somewhere, or what have you. But if you're in an apartment building and it's super hot and you don't have an air conditioner, then you're more likely to go to a green space and try and get away from the heat and escape. And these people are now in a vulnerable situation because they're at risk of getting heat stroke. They have no private green space for them to reside in or try and get away from the heat. So we're seeing these are the inequalities that we're already experiencing are going to be exacerbated in the future. Trying to mitigate this as much as possible, trying to untangle things such as the behavior might help mitigate that.
Okay, we're just about out of time for the Q&A. We have a bunch more questions, so feel free to come up and talk to our panelists during the break. I kind of want to maybe tie up a couple here really quickly with a concluding question about, really infrastructure as an opportunity. So far we've talked about it a lot as sort of this problem, this thing that we need to understand and we kind of fight over and all understand, differently. But infrastructure, like climate change, is a deeply kind of place-based concern. And so how in your work can communities be involved? Can communities come together? Can communities be formed and strengthened through the effort to improve access to infrastructures that you're talking about?
I'll take a stab at it. I think it's becoming more and more of a pressing issue. I think there are a number of very socially minded organizations out there who, Isla Urbana is one that we've been working with, who are, don't have the traditional bottom line, but have social impact as one of their main things they're trying to contribute towards. And I feel like those types of organizations are ways to make a strong impact. And a lot of what we're doing in our work and what we're trying to help facilitate is to help to empower those organizations and provide support to those types of organizations to be able to make the most positive impact that they can, and try to bring together other like-minded organizations and researchers to do so as in our own work.
Yeah, similarly, I think as many people kind of having this conversation, the better, and having as many different approaches is the better. One thing we noticed when we were looking at these different types of parks, and one question was, how do we increase the appeal of parks? Another one was, well, how do we make people closer to parks, or move, rather than having more parks in and around the city, how do we have a park that's closer to people? And Toronto lifting the ability to have, instead of single detached homes, having multi-duplexes and all that, that increases the likelihood of having higher density in and around green spaces. And so I think lots of approaches could be used, and therefore the greater the conversation with more people involved for such an interdisciplinary topic, the better.
So I think last things I'll say is, green infrastructure really provides the opportunity because it's decentralized. It relies on community stewardship, unlike centralized infrastructure, for different community actors to come together to, sort of build it, operate it, and maintain it. And I think therein lies an opportunity for community development and for communities to come together to reimagine, how they would create a certain kind of green space, but also how they might, participate in reducing future flooding risk in their city. And that can become a conversation starter for how we might adapt as a city together.
Okay, that's a great way to transition into the next part of our panel. That went really fast. It was wonderful to hear about our work and get your thoughtful answers to some of these questions. Luckily, we have Maya Carrasquillo to act as our international discussant. Again, Maya is a professor at UC Berkeley in civil environmental engineering. Maya's work touches deeply on all of these issues, and so we'd like to turn it over to Maya now to hear what you have to say about all these things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you, everyone, for the invitation to just share a little bit about my past and current work. I admittedly only from upstate New York, so being invited as an international discussant to Toronto just makes me laugh just a little bit, but it's really great to be back east on this side of the country. So first want to acknowledge and honor the work of everyone that's on this panel. I think this discussion is going to kind of tie in very nicely with several of the points that were made earlier. And also honor the work of planners, the social sciences and humanities, and hoping to shift the conversation from my discipline as an environmental engineer to really follow the work that's already been, like you all have already kind of laid the groundwork. Truly, it is only because of your work that engineers, primarily in civil and environmental engineering, have recently created space in the prioritization of justice and equity in the work that we do. UC Berkeley colleague of mine, Deb McCoy, likes to describe the work of planners as being one of the few fields where we can dream about new futures. And so I would like to build on that idea in that if planners are dreamers, and engineers are the ones who help to make those dreams reality. And so because of this, I'd like to frame this discussion vantage point of beyond the planning. So engineers have a real critical role in the design, implementation, and operation and maintenance of infrastructure. When I think about infrastructure, and typically in my field as we think about infrastructure being defined by the American Society of Civil Engineers and their infrastructure report card, which includes aviation, bridges, broadband, dams, drinking water, energy, hazardous waste, inland waterways, levees, public parks, ports, rail, roads, schools, solid waste, stormwater, transit, and wastewater. I want to take this opportunity back to a question you had earlier, though, Robert, because I think that there is an interesting tension in how we define infrastructure. This is how ASCE defines it. If we were to refer back to U.S. Army Corps, typically they think of infrastructure and critical infrastructure being defined from a place of national security. And so even when you think about how it's qualified, there's a lot of political reasons for why and how we think about critical infrastructure and infrastructure broadly. I teach classes on social justice and engineering and inclusive infrastructure, and I like to challenge my students to think beyond, as we typically as engineers, the material, the physical, the built infrastructure, but to think about it as the connection points and really the services that allow us to live our day-to-day lives with the best quality. And so even including social infrastructure, there's literature around bodies as infrastructure, right? And so as we begin to think about this conversation, when we say infrastructure, beyond the material, there's opportunities for us to think more broadly about how we connect. Currently in the US, we are at this interesting convergence of several key milestones at the federal level that are further helping to frame this discussion of unequal access to infrastructure and how to address it. First, we have the bipartisan infrastructure law. From the White House, it says it's an investment in US infrastructure, competitiveness, and communities. This law is a historic opportunity to rebuild America's roads, bridges, and rails, expand access to clean drinking water, ensure that every American has access to high-speed internet, to tackle the climate crisis and advance environmental justice while investing in communities, both urban and rural, that have too often been left behind. In addition to this, we also have the Justice 40 initiative, which states that 40% of overall benefits of certain investments must go to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. And so this is being implemented across each of our federal agencies, and now trickling down to each of the states as well. So what does this mean in the context of this panel discussion and the overall symposium today? That there, for the first time in the US, is an institutionalized support to address and correct past harms through unequal access are experienced through unequal access and burden of environmental pollutants, and an opportunity to do so through reinvesting in the nation's infrastructure. So I'd like to just share a few examples from my own work that highlight some of these themes that we discussed earlier in the panel. So first I want to share some of the work that I've done previously in the southeast of the US, particularly in Tampa, Florida, around stormwater management. So this example of East Tampa, Florida, East Tampa being a predominantly and historically black community that has experienced a number of environmental injustices over the years. Building on the first panel even, I want to just highlight this quote from Ibram X. Kendi in his book, Stamped from the Beginning. He states that the principal function of racist ideas in America has been the suppression of resistance to racial discrimination and its resulting racial disparities. The beneficiaries of slavery, segregation, and mass incarceration have produced racist ideas of black people being best suited for or deserving of the confines of slavery, segregation, or the jail cell. Consumers of these racist ideas have been led to believe that there is something wrong with black people and not the policies that have enslaved, oppressed, and confined so many black people. And so these policies that Kendi speaks about include practices like redlining, highway infrastructure development, or even more broadly, infrastructure development, even as we think about it today, and industrial land use throughout black communities in the US. And so these same patterns can be seen throughout Tampa's history, and specifically for places like East Tampa, which in many ways is a typical Southern African American community, particularly in terms of the legal and cultural enforcement of segregation laws along racial lines that delineated space and placement of black communities associated with but located outside surrounding white communities. So not unlike several historically black communities in the United States, East Tampa is bordered by two of Tampa's major highways, Interstate 275 on the western border and I-4 along the southern border. It is also home to 34 stormwater ponds. It also has the largest density of stormwater ponds per square mile of any community in Tampa. These ponds are often poorly maintained, fenced in, primarily in residential areas. And as most residents would tell you, eyesores to the community. And so as Alex mentioned earlier, my work sought to understand the why. Why are these stormwater ponds, why does East Tampa have the highest density of stormwater ponds? And what are the historical and socio-political decisions that led to this current characterization of stormwater infrastructure in the community? Part of the rich history of East Tampa includes several revitalization efforts of ponds, particularly in high traffic areas, and a lot of this effort was led by East Tampa residents to include incorporate entities such as boardwalks, educational signage, and I would say most prominently the renaming of several of these stormwater ponds from stormwater ponds to community lakes after prominent East Tampa leaders and activists. A huge motivation for revitalizing the ponds was the opportunity to shift outsider perspectives of East Tampa. One of the residents, when interviewed, was quoted highlighting that people tend to think that there is no buy-in to the community, but that's not true. There's a rich, rich history in East Tampa. We had a hospital in East Tampa, a lot of nursing homes still there, and 22nd Street, which is one of the largest through streets, had a large number of businesses that are still operational today. Based on some of the work we heard earlier, it would have actually been really great to quantify the use of these spaces before and after revitalization efforts to see the activity and how these efforts improved. Or how these efforts improve the accessibility to these spaces. Through interviews, though, it was also clear the differences in perception of the ponds, not only by residents, but compared to those in utility or city agencies. To residents, these lakes were an opportunity to build amenities and give access points to residents in the community. But one person in the city of Tampa's Transportation and Stormwater Department was quoted saying, "We do not look at stormwater ponds as an amenity. A stormwater pond to us is a retention and detention facility." So this speaks to some of the key differences in understanding across important stakeholder groups, and our responsibility is to continue exploring strategies that can bring these historically divergent perspectives together. My work also highlighted that from a systems perspective, East Tampa as a case study, the key variables that had previously caused a shift in decision-making for stormwater management in the community was community activism and taking on larger roles in the city and county leadership and governance, incorporating strategies for local workforce development, as we touched on earlier, to help manage these systems, and then the legacy of community pride that led to and continues to champion efforts to improve the community's infrastructure overall. So in general, the work really sought to emphasize the importance of including diverse perspectives when making key decisions for infrastructure, and also highlighted the history in doing so in this particular community. I want to just also give a quick snapshot of some of the current projects we have going on in California. Recently, there's a funded project from the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, in partnership with the San Francisco Estuary Institute and community-based organizations in Richmond and East Oakland to explore the design and implementation of community-driven green stormwater infrastructure in these communities. We heard earlier from both Nidhi and Amy, there's an important role in decentralized infrastructure in the way that we think about equitable access to these amenities. Even more so, the last thing that I wanted to highlight from my work is this concept of infrastructural deserts. And even as we are prioritizing and focusing on unequal access and burden through efforts like Justice 40 and the Biden infrastructure law, bipartisan infrastructure law, the question has still been recently exploring is who is still being left out from these efforts. How do we characterize vulnerability? What and who decides who is vulnerable? And as highlighted earlier, because so much of our infrastructure and access to it is dependent on connection to some sort of grid system, this often displaces or continues to marginalize those who may not have housing, who may be in informal settlements. And so we're thinking about how to make access equitable across these different subpopulations. We really need to consider beyond just those who have access to grids, but what does it look like to develop decentralized systems and better characterize where we see gaps even in hyper-urban areas. I wanted to just leave with some closing thoughts because I think I'm pretty close to being over time. We highlighted earlier the importance of data in its multiple forms to understand historical, like current and future planning of equitable infrastructure, and not just characterizing the data, and not just getting the data from our perspective, but how do we make it accessible for multiple stakeholders and communities to be able to take advantage of things that we have from the academic perspective. As I mentioned, even with new laws and policies focusing on environmental justice more explicitly, still this question, and I want to challenge you all to think about this question of who is still not included in how we plan, design, or repair our infrastructure, who is truly most vulnerable and remains outside of these efforts to overcome unequal access, even as we consider environmental and climate justice in our work. And finally, there's so many opportunities in bringing diverse perspectives, both from a cross-disciplinary lens, but I'd also offer from a cross-positionality perspective as well. I think when we continue to bring in not only different disciplinary perspectives, but different folks coming from variety of backgrounds, we'll begin to start to think more critically about how we can actually have access across different spaces and places. And yeah, finally, not just quantifying or qualifying environmental injustice, but truly creating opportunities through the structure that we're building for planning and designing for environmental and climate justice. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to take part in this discussion today, and yeah, thank each of my colleagues for their insights.
Okay, thank you so much. And that brings our panel to a close. So let's thank Maya and all of our panelists.
Wow, so many more questions that we have now to talk about. We're going to squeeze in one more panel before we let you have lunch, but there is more coffee, water, snacks. There's places to have a break. We're going to meet back here in 15 minutes for our final panel. So come back here 11:30, or I'll ring this bell and call you in. Thank you all.